So let's start out by looking at, again, the evolution of virtual learning, some of the trends that have been taking place. And I thought the place to begin would be really kind of thinking about, how is e-learning evolving leading up to the pandemic? And what we've seen certainly over the last few decades is a tremendous increase in the amount of training that is delivered through technology. If you go back, as recently as, the early 2000s, what you found was only about 10% of training was delivered through technology. Whereas in 2019, right before the pandemic, we saw that that figure had increased to 40% of training being delivered through some form of technology. The majority of that was more kind of self-directed as opposed to instructor-led training. So individuals doing online, programs as opposed to kind of live instructor virtual-led programs. What's interesting is while we've seen this tremendous increase in virtual learning, we also at the same time haven't seen the demise of the classroom, which some had been predicting for some time. And in fact, prior to the pandemic, we actually saw that instructor-led live face-to-face classroom was still the dominant delivery mechanism for corporate training. Over 50%, about, depending on the survey you look at, about 55 to 60% of training was still being done in that face-to-face traditional environment. What's also interesting is that if you look at kind of the trends of e-learning over the last decade or so, what we've seen is that it's kind of plateaued in the sense of going back to as recently as about 2011, around 40% of training at that time was being delivered via technology. And that's basically what we were seeing in 2019, which led many to question whether we had kind of pushed out as much training as we could realistically do over technology and maybe hit kind of a ceiling. There have been predictions for a number of years that some new technologies, whether it was mobile or virtual reality, might lead to kind of a new wave of e-learning, but we really hadn't seen that materialize. In fact, those kind of mobile virtual reality, augmented reality, those methods still were a very small slice of the overall kind of corporate training portfolios.